The boarding line moved slowly as passengers filed onto the plane bound for Washington, D.C. Among them stood Grace Wilson, clutching her boarding pass and small carry-on bag. At 63, she wasn't particularly fond of flying, not as a passenger anyway. After 27 years working on military aircraft as an Air Force mechanic, sitting in a seat while someone else handled the controls felt strange, almost wrong. Boarding Group C. "Now boarding," called the gate attendant. Grace took a deep breath and shuffled forward with the others. Her hip ached slightly, a reminder of why she was making this trip in the first place. The doctors at Walter Reed had better options for treating her condition than the VA hospital back home in Seattle. Inside the plane, she counted the rows until she reached 12F. A window seat over the wing, perfect. If she had to fly, she at least wanted to see the part of the plane she understood best. As a mechanic, she'd spent countless hours on those very wings, checking flaps, inspecting rivets, and ensuring every piece was exactly as it should be. "Excuse me?" she murmured to the businessman already seated in the aisle. He stood without looking up from his phone, allowing her to squeeze past. Grace settled into her seat, immediately fastening her seatbelt and adjusting it with practiced hands. The worn metal dog tag hanging from her medical alert bracelet clinked softly against the plastic armrest. That tag had been with her through 3 wars, 14 overseas deployments, and more aircraft than she could count. Now it served a practical purpose. Her medical information was engraved on the back right below her service number. A young flight attendant paused in the aisle. "First time flying?" she asked with a kind smile, noticing how Grace gripped the armrests. Grace laughed softly. "No, just not used to being on this side of things. I used to fix planes, not ride in them." "Oh, well, I promise this one's in good shape," the attendant replied cheerfully before moving on. "If you only knew," Grace thought, her trained eye already spotting the slightly uneven wear on the wing's leading edge visible through her window. Nothing dangerous, just the kind of detail most people would never notice, but that stood out clearly to someone who had spent her life ensuring aircraft safety. The middle seat remained empty as the final passengers boarded, a small blessing. The businessman beside her had already plugged in headphones and closed his eyes, clearly a veteran traveler with no interest in small talk. That suited Grace just fine. She wasn't much for conversation with strangers anyway. As the plane began to push back from the gate, Grace's fingers instinctively reached for her dog tag, rubbing the worn metal surface. It was a habit formed during her first deployment, a quiet ritual before each mission. The tag represented everything she'd accomplished in her career, achievements mostly unknown to the general public. Of her fellow passengers would guess that the older woman in seat 12F had once been responsible for keeping F-15s flying during Operation Desert Storm, or that she had personally developed a crucial modification to the hydraulic systems of F-22 Raptors that had saved pilots' lives. Her work had always been behind the scenes, the kind that earned respect within military circles but rarely made headlines. The engines roared as the plane accelerated down the runway. Grace felt the familiar sensation of being pressed back into her seat as the nose lifted. Despite her unease at being a passenger, she couldn't help but appreciate the power and engineering that went into making something as heavy as a commercial airliner defy gravity so smoothly. Once they reached cruising altitude, Grace relaxed slightly and gazed out at the clouds below. Her thoughts drifted to the base where she'd spent most of her career. By now, a whole new generation of mechanics would be maintaining the aircraft she once knew so intimately. Did they still use some of the procedures she had developed? Did anyone remember the name Wilson in connection with the emergency landing protocol that had become standard training? The businessman beside her got up to use the restroom, briefly interrupting her thoughts. As he returned, he finally seemed to notice her. "Heading to D.C. for business or pleasure?" he asked politely. "Medical," Grace replied simply. She wasn't one for sharing personal details. He nodded sympathetically. "Walter Reed?" When she looked surprised, he added, "The medical bracelet. My brother's military had to go there last year." "Yes," she admitted. "Got some old injuries they think they can help with." "Military yourself?" he asked, glancing at the dog tag. Grace nodded. "Air Force. Long time ago now." "Thank you for your service," he said, the standard response civilians gave when they learned someone had served. He seemed about to ask more when the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing the cabin to shake briefly. Several passengers gasped or gripped their armrests tighter. Grace remained calm, recognizing the normal movement of an aircraft adjusting to changing air conditions. This was nothing compared to the time she'd been called to inspect a fighter jet that had returned with battle damage, its landing gear partially compromised. That had been real danger. The flight attendants began their beverage service, moving slowly down the aisle with their cart. Grace declined a drink, preferring to stay alert. Old habits died hard. As a mechanic, she had never touched alcohol during duty hours, and somehow being on an aircraft still felt like being on duty. The woman across the aisle, noticing Grace's steady calm during the turbulence, leaned over. "You're so relaxed. I hate these bumpy flights." Grace smiled politely. "Just normal air pockets. The plane's designed to handle much worse." "Are you a pilot?" the woman asked. "No, just worked on planes for a while," Grace replied, deliberately downplaying her extensive career. She never saw the point in broadcasting her accomplishments. In her line of work, doing the job right meant nothing went wrong, which meant no one noticed your contribution at all. The woman nodded, seemingly disappointed by the mundane answer, then returned to her magazine. Few civilians understood the deep pride Grace took in her work. How each aircraft she had maintained was like a patient entrusted to her care. Every plane that returned safely was a personal victory. As the flight continued, Grace pulled out the folder containing her medical records. The doctors had warned her that the hip replacement might be complicated due to an old injury from her early days in the service. She'd been knocked off a maintenance platform during a surprise drill, falling 12 feet onto a concrete hangar floor. At the time, young and determined to prove herself in the male-dominated field, she had downplayed the injury and returned to work too soon. Now, decades later, her body was demanding payment for that youthful stubbornness. The constant ache had become too much to ignore, affecting her ability to garden or take long walks with her dog. It was time to get it fixed properly. Outside her window, the sun began to set, painting the clouds in brilliant oranges and pinks. Grace watched the colors shift and change, reminded of countless sunsets she'd witnessed from airfields around the world. From Saudi Arabia to South Korea, Germany to Japan, she had followed the aircraft, keeping them flying through peace and war alike. Most of the other passengers saw her as just another older woman traveling alone, perhaps a grandmother visiting family or a retiree on vacation. They couldn't see the memories she carried, the specialized knowledge in her hands, or the quiet pride she felt in her service. To them, she was just the unremarkable person in seat 12F, nothing more. Grace preferred it that way. She had never sought recognition or praise, finding satisfaction in a job well done rather than accolades. The pilots whose lives had depended on her work knew her value, as did the commanders who had requested her specifically for difficult missions. That had always been enough. As the plane continued eastward through the darkening sky, Grace finally allowed herself to doze, her hand still resting protectively on the dog tag that connected her to her past. In her dreams, she was young again, confidently moving around an aircraft, tools in hand, the respect of her colleagues, evident in their faces as she solved problems that had stumped others. Little did she know that this routine flight would soon take an unexpected turn, one that would bring her past accomplishments into sharp focus and remind her that some contributions are never truly forgotten, even when the person who made them believes they are. Grace woke with a slight jolt as the plane hit another patch of turbulence. The cabin was dimmer now, with most of the overhead lights turned down to allow passengers to rest. Outside her window, dark clouds had replaced the sunset, occasionally illuminated by distant flashes of lightning. She checked her watch. They'd been in the air for just over 3 hours. A soft ding sounded through the cabin, followed by the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking. I apologize for interrupting your flight, but I need to provide an important update. There's a significant weather system developing over our destination in Washington, D.C. Air traffic control has informed us that all incoming flights to Reagan National are currently experiencing delays of 3 hours or more." Grace frowned. A 3-hour delay would mean missing her evening check-in at the hospital. She'd have to call and reschedule. The captain continued, "Rather than placing us in a holding pattern, we've been offered an alternative. Due to the severity of the weather system, we've received clearance to land at Westfield Air Force Base in Pennsylvania, approximately 150 miles from D.C. The airline will arrange ground transportation from there to Washington. A collective groan rose from the passengers. The businessman beside Grace shook his head in frustration, already pulling out his phone to check messages despite the aircraft's restrictions on cellular use. But Grace had stopped listening after hearing the name of the base. Westfield. Her heart beat a little faster as memories flooded back. Westfield Air Force Base wasn't just any military installation. It was where she had spent nearly a decade of her career, training countless pilots and mechanics on advanced aircraft systems. It was where she had developed her emergency landing protocol for damaged fighter jets, a procedure that had later been adopted throughout the Air Force. "We'll be beginning our descent in approximately 20 minutes," the captain finished. "Flight attendants will provide more information about arrangements once we're on the ground." Passengers around Grace immediately began chatting anxiously about missed connections and delayed plans. A mother across the aisle worried aloud about getting her children to bed at a reasonable hour. A group of business travelers discussed hotel options and whether their companies would cover unexpected expenses. Grace remained quiet, her thoughts turning to Westfield. It had been, 15 years since she'd last set foot there? After her promotion to Master Sergeant, she'd been transferred to bases overseas, eventually finishing her career in Japan before retiring to Seattle. Would the base look the same? Would anyone still working there remember her? Probably not, she decided. Military personnel rotated frequently. After 15 years, most of her colleagues would have moved on, retired, or been reassigned multiple times. Still, the thought of returning to Westfield stirred something in her, a mixture of nostalgia and pride. The plane began its descent through the storm clouds. Grace noticed the change in engine pitch immediately, feeling the aircraft banking as it changed course. The turbulence intensified briefly, causing several passengers to grip their armrests. The businessman beside her closed his eyes and took deep breaths, clearly uncomfortable. "It's just air pockets," Grace said reassuringly. "Perfectly normal during descent through weather." He opened one eye. "You're awfully calm." Grace smiled slightly. "I've been through worse landings." As they broke through the cloud layer, Grace pressed closer to the window. The landscape below was coming into view. Rolling hills and dense forests she recognized immediately. And there, emerging through the rain, was Westfield Air Force Base. The main runway stretched out, bright lights marking its edges despite the daylight hours, standard procedure during storm conditions. Then she spotted something that made her breath catch. Flanking their commercial airliner, barely visible through the rain, were two fighter jets, F-22 Raptors, the Air Force's premier tactical aircraft. They were escorting the civilian plane to the runway, maintaining a safe distance while guiding them in. "Look at that," Grace whispered, mostly to herself. The businessman leaned over to peek through her window. "Are those military jets? What are they doing?" "Standard procedure when a civilian aircraft makes an unscheduled landing at a military installation," Grace explained. "They're escorting us in." What she didn't say was how intimately she knew those aircraft. The F-22 had been in its early deployment phase during her later years at Westfield. She had been among the mechanics who helped identify and correct several critical issues in the aircraft's initial design. Her hands had been inside the belly of those magnificent machines, learning every wire, every hydraulic line, every potential weak point. The Raptors peeled away as their commercial jet made its final approach. Grace watched them go with a twinge of affection. To most people, fighter jets represented power, speed, or military might. To her, they were more like old friends whose quirks and secrets she had come to know well over decades. The landing was smooth despite the weather, a credit to the pilot. As they taxied toward a hangar area separate from the main military operations, Grace could see personnel moving efficiently across the tarmac, preparing for their arrival. Military precision never changed, she thought with approval. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Westfield Air Force Base," the flight attendant announced once they had come to a complete stop. "Due to security protocols, we ask that you remain seated until further instructions. Representatives from both the Air Force and our airline will be boarding shortly to explain arrangements." The passengers waited restlessly. Children whined, adults checked watches and phones. Grace alone sat patiently, her hands folded in her lap, dog tag catching the overhead light as it dangled from her medical bracelet. After about 15 minutes, the aircraft door opened. A young Air Force lieutenant entered, followed by a harried-looking airline representative. They spoke briefly with the flight crew before addressing the passengers. "Good afternoon," the lieutenant began, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to briefings. "I'm Lieutenant Chen, liaison officer for Westfield Air Force Base. On behalf of Colonel Richards and the United States Air Force, we welcome you to our installation. While this is certainly not your intended destination, we'll do everything possible to make your stay brief and comfortable." The airline representative stepped forward, explaining that buses had been arranged to transport passengers to Washington, D.C., but wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. In the meantime, passengers would be escorted to a waiting area in one of the base's civilian-accessible buildings. Grace listened carefully to the instructions. As a former Air Force member, she understood the complex logistics involved in unexpectedly hosting over 100 civilians on a secure military base. Someone had been making phone calls and pulling strings to make this happen smoothly. As passengers began to deplane, Grace gathered her small carry-on and medical folder. She waited patiently for her row to be called, observing the familiar military efficiency with appreciation. When it was finally her turn to exit, she moved carefully down the aisle, her stiff hip protesting after hours of sitting. Stepping from the aircraft, the familiar smell of jet fuel and rain-soaked tarmac brought an unexpected lump to her throat. How many times had she stood on ramps just like this one, in downpours and snowstorms and desert heat, preparing aircraft for missions or welcoming them back? The sensory memory was so strong it momentarily took her breath away. The passengers were directed toward a covered walkway leading to a single-story building at the edge of the airfield. Grace fell into step with the others, but her eyes kept drifting across the base that had once been her second home. Much had changed. New buildings had appeared, others had been renovated or repurposed. But the basic layout remained the same. Over there would be the maintenance hangars where she had spent countless hours. Beyond them, the barracks and administrative buildings. And somewhere to the north, the specialized training facilities where she had taught maintenance procedures to fresh-faced pilots and mechanics. As they approached the building, Grace noticed 2 Raptor pilots walking briskly toward them, still in their flight suits. They must have been the ones escorting the airliner in, she realized. Both looked impossibly young to her, probably in their early 30s, though military aviators often seemed younger than their years. Grace found herself automatically assessing them with a mechanic's eye. The confident stride, the way they carried their helmets, the expressions of focused professionalism. Good pilots, she decided, the kind who would treat their aircraft with respect rather than pushing the machines beyond reasonable limits just to show off. Little did she know that within minutes these 2 pilots would completely change the course of her unexpected visit to Westfield, and remind her that some legacies, though unsung, are never truly forgotten. The waiting area was a large conference room hastily repurposed for the stranded passengers. Folding tables had been set up along one wall with water, coffee, and packaged snacks. Military personnel and airline representatives moved efficiently around the space, answering questions and helping passengers make calls to rearrange their plans. Grace found a seat near a window overlooking the airfield. From here, she could see their plane still parked on the tarmac, rain streaming down its fuselage. Beyond it, the 2 F-22 Raptors had been moved to a hangar, ground crews already swarming around them performing post-flight checks. The businessman from the plane, Tom, he'd finally introduced himself as, dropped into the chair beside her. "They're saying at least 2 hours until the buses arrive," he sighed. "I'm going to miss my meeting entirely." Grace nodded sympathetically. "Weather doesn't care about our schedules." True enough. He took a sip of coffee from a paper cup. "Have you ever been here before? You seemed to recognize the place when we landed." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "I was stationed here for a while." "Long time ago now? Really?" He looked at her with new interest. "What did you do in the Air Force?" "Aircraft maintenance," she said simply. "I worked on fighters mostly." Before he could ask more questions, an announcement came over the room's PA system. "Attention passengers. We understand many of you have connecting flights and arrangements in Washington. Representatives are available at the front tables to help you make alternative plans. We also have phones available if you need to contact anyone. Grace realized she should call the hospital to reschedule her check-in. Rising slowly, she picked up her medical folder and made her way toward the phone set up at the far end of the room. Her hip protested after the long flight, making her limp slightly. As she crossed the room, the door opened and the two Raptor pilots entered. They were speaking with the lieutenant who had met the plane earlier. Something about transportation arrangements, Grace gathered as she passed by them. She had nearly reached the phones when she realized she didn't have the hospital's number with her. It was stored in her phone, which was in her carry-on back at her seat. With a small sigh of frustration, she turned to head back. As she did, her medical bracelet caught on the edge of a table, pulling her wrist sharply. The clasp broke, sending the bracelet and its attached dog tag clattering to the floor. Oh, Grace knelt awkwardly, her stiff hip making the movement difficult. The bracelet had slid under the edge of a chair. "Let me help you, ma'am," said a voice above her. One of the Raptor pilots had noticed her difficulty and stepped over. "Thank you," Grace said, straightening up slowly as the young man retrieved her bracelet. The pilot, a captain by his insignia, held the bracelet up to hand it back to her. As he did, his eyes fell on the dog tag attached to it. His expression changed subtly, his gaze sharpening as he read the name and service number stamped into the metal. "Wilson?" he said, his voice suddenly different. "G. Wilson." Grace nodded, slightly confused by his reaction. "That's right." The captain was staring at the tag now, turning it over to see the information engraved on the back. "Service number 87532-10047? "Yes," Grace confirmed, her confusion growing. "Do I know you, Captain?" Instead of answering, the captain turned and beckoned to his fellow pilot, who was still speaking with the lieutenant. "Major Reynolds." "You need to see this." The major excused himself and walked over, his expression questioning. The captain held out Grace's dog tag. "Look at the name and service number," he said with an odd intensity in his voice. The major took the bracelet, examining the tag closely. His eyes widened, then moved from the tag to Grace's face with a look of dawning recognition. "Are you the G. Wilson?" he asked. "Master Sergeant Grace Wilson, who developed the emergency hydraulic bypass procedure for the F-22? Grace was taken aback. It had been years since anyone had mentioned her work. "Yes, that was one of my projects." "How did you—" "Ma'am," the major said, suddenly standing straighter. "Your procedure saved my life 3 years ago over the Persian Gulf. Hydraulic failure at 30,000 feet. If not for your bypass system, I wouldn't be standing here." The captain was nodding eagerly. "Every pilot who flies the Raptor knows your name, ma'am. The Wilson bypass is part of our emergency training. I've never had to use it myself, but I've known 2 pilots besides the major here who did." Grace felt heat rising to her cheeks. It was just my job," she said, flustered by their recognition. "I saw a flaw in the original system and developed a workaround. A workaround that saved at least 7 aircraft and their pilots that I know of," the major said firmly. "May I ask what brings you to Westfield, Master Sergeant?" "I'm retired now," Grace corrected gently. "Just Ms. Wilson. I was on my way to Walter Reed for a hip replacement. The flight got diverted, as you know." The 2 pilots exchanged glances. "Walter Reed?" the captain repeated. "Are you receiving care there for a service-connected condition?" Grace nodded. "An old injury from my early days. Fell off a maintenance platform. Never healed quite right." The major handed her bracelet back with a respect that seemed almost ceremonial. "Ms. Wilson, would you mind waiting here for a moment? I'd like to speak with the base commander about your situation." Before Grace could object, the major strode off, already pulling out his phone. The captain stayed with her, his posture still formally attentive. "I don't understand," Grace said. "It's just a flight delay. I don't want to cause any trouble." "It's no trouble at all, ma'am," the captain assured her. "Major Reynolds just wants to make sure you're properly taken care of while you're here." Grace felt distinctly uncomfortable. She had never sought recognition for her work and wasn't sure how to handle it now that it had found her anyway. The businessman, Tom, approached curiously. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Grace said quickly. "Just a mix-up with my medical information." The captain gave her a surprised look but didn't contradict her. Tom nodded and returned to his seat, leaving Grace with the increasingly awkward awareness that the captain was still standing at something very close to attention beside her. "Please, at ease, Captain," she said quietly. I've been retired for 8 years. I'm just another civilian now. Not to us, ma'am, he replied, though he did relax his posture slightly. Your work is still saving lives. That doesn't expire with your service. Across the room, other passengers had begun to notice the unusual interaction. A few were watching curiously as the major returned, accompanied now by a full colonel with silver eagles on his shoulders. The colonel approached briskly, his hand already extended. Ms. Wilson, he said warmly. I'm Colonel Richard Harding, base commander. It's an honor to have you at Westfield even under these circumstances. Grace shook his hand, feeling increasingly bewildered. Thank you, sir. But I don't understand all this attention. The colonel smiled. Major Reynolds has just informed me who you are. The Wilson bypass system isn't just used in F-22s anymore. It's been adapted for the F-35 program and several other aircraft. It's part of the standard training for every fighter pilot in the Air Force now. Grace blinked in surprise. She'd had no idea her procedure had been implemented so widely. When she'd developed it, it had been a specific solution to a specific problem with early Raptor hydraulics. I had no idea, she admitted. Your modesty is noted and appreciated, the colonel said with a smile. But the fact remains that your innovation has saved aircraft worth billions of dollars and, more importantly, the lives of dozens of pilots. He glanced at her medical folder, which she was still clutching. Major Reynolds tells me you're en route to Walter Reed for treatment? Grace nodded. Just a hip replacement. Nothing serious. I understand the buses won't be here for some time yet, the colonel continued. Would you allow us to offer you some hospitality while you wait? Our officers' mess makes an excellent cup of coffee, much better than what they're serving here. And I suspect there are several people on base who would be honored to meet you. Grace looked around at the crowded waiting area, at the other passengers still trying to arrange their travel plans. I wouldn't want special treatment. It's not special treatment, the colonel interrupted gently. It's respect where respect is due. And if I may speak freely, it's long overdue. Grace hesitated, looking back at her carry-on still beside the chair where Tom sat. My bag? Captain Lee can bring it for you, Colonel Harding said, nodding to the younger pilot, who immediately moved to retrieve it. Still feeling somewhat dazed by the turn of events, Grace allowed herself to be escorted from the waiting area. As they left, she noticed other passengers watching curiously, including Tom, who gave her a puzzled look. She offered a small shrug in response, just as confused as he was by the situation. The small group, Grace, Colonel Harding, Major Reynolds, and Captain Lee carrying her bag, walked through corridors that were both familiar and strange to her. The basic layout of the base hadn't changed, but renovations and updates had transformed many of the spaces she once knew. We've expanded significantly since you were last stationed here, the colonel explained as they walked. The training program you helped develop has grown into its own division. We now have pilots from allied nations coming through to learn our maintenance and emergency protocols. I had no idea, Grace said honestly. When I left, my work was just one procedure among many. Major Reynolds shook his head. It was never just a procedure, ma'am. The Wilson bypass changed how we approach emergency hydraulic failures. Before that, pilots had maybe 90 seconds to prepare for ejection if the primary and backup systems failed. With your system, we have up to 8 minutes in most cases, enough time to bring the aircraft down safely. They arrived at the officers' mess, a spacious room with dark wood paneling and tables arranged neatly throughout. At this hour, between standard meal times, it was mostly empty. A few officers looked up as they entered, their conversations pausing momentarily. Colonel Harding led them to a table near the windows overlooking the flight line. A server approached immediately. Coffee all around, I think, the colonel said, then glanced at Grace. Unless you'd prefer something else? Coffee is fine, thank you, she replied, still trying to process everything happening around her. As the server departed, Captain Lee set her bag down beside her chair. I hope you don't mind, ma'am, but I took the liberty of sending a message to Lieutenant Colonel Rivera. She's our head of maintenance training now, and I thought she'd want to know you were here. Before Grace could respond, the door to the mess opened again, and a woman in her 40s hurried in. Her uniform bore the silver oak leaf of a lieutenant colonel, and her expression was one of barely contained excitement. Is it true? She asked, approaching their table. Master Sergeant Wilson is actually here? Colonel Harding stood. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera, may I introduce Grace Wilson? Ms. Wilson, this is Lieutenant Colonel Diana Rivera, head of our maintenance training division. The woman extended her hand, which Grace shook somewhat automatically. It's such an honor, Lieutenant Colonel Rivera said earnestly. Your work forms the foundation of much of what we teach now. Please join us, Colonel Harding invited, gesturing to an empty chair. As Lieutenant Colonel Rivera sat down, their coffee arrived. Grace took a sip, grateful for something normal to do while everyone looked at her with expressions ranging from respect to outright admiration. I'm sorry, Grace said finally. This is all very unexpected. I was just a mechanic doing my job. With all due respect, ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Rivera said, you were never just anything. Your insights into the F-22's hydraulic systems revealed flaws that the manufacturers themselves missed, and your bypass solution was so elegant that it's been adapted for multiple aircraft platforms since then. The Major nodded in agreement. When I experienced my hydraulic failure, I was over water at night in bad weather. Without those extra minutes your system provided, I wouldn't have made it to the carrier. Grace felt a lump forming in her throat. Throughout her career, she had rarely received direct acknowledgement for her work. As a woman in a predominantly male field, she had often found it easier to keep her head down and let her work speak for itself. Commendations had come occasionally, but they were usually formal recognitions that ended up in a file somewhere. Not this kind of personal gratitude. I'm glad it helped, she said simply. More than helped, the colonel said. But I sense you're uncomfortable with praise, so let's change the subject. Tell me about your trip to Walter Reed. When is your procedure scheduled? Grateful for the shift in focus, Grace explained about her hip replacement scheduled for the following day. I was supposed to check in this evening. I'll need to call and reschedule once I reach D.C. Colonel Harding exchanged glances with Lieutenant Colonel Rivera. What if you didn't have to reschedule? Grace looked at him quizzically. The buses won't arrive for at least 2 hours, and then it's another 3 to D.C. I'll never make my check-in time. I wasn't thinking about the buses, the colonel said. We have a C-21 departing for Andrews Air Force Base in 40 minutes. It's a short flight, maybe an hour in this weather. From Andrews, we could have you at Walter Reed in 30 minutes by car. Grace stared at him. You'd put me on a military transport? It's not unusual for us to accommodate distinguished visitors, he replied smoothly. And I'd say your contributions to Air Force safety more than qualify you as distinguished. But I'm a civilian now, Grace protested weakly. A retired master sergeant is never fully a civilian, Major Reynolds said with a smile. Once Air Force, always Air Force. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera leaned forward. Before you answer, there's someone else who'd like to speak with you. She pulled out her phone and made a brief call. He'll be here in 5 minutes. Grace sipped her coffee, wondering who else could possibly want to meet her. As they waited, the conversation turned to changes at the base over the years. Grace found herself relaxing slightly, on more comfortable ground talking about maintenance facilities and training programs than her own accomplishments. True to Lieutenant Colonel Rivera's word, 5 minutes later the mess door opened again. A silver-haired man in his 60s entered, wearing the uniform of a brigadier general. Grace didn't recognize him until he smiled. Then memory clicked into place. Lieutenant Williams, she said in disbelief. Brigadier General now, he corrected with a warm smile. But yes, the very same. It's been what, 20 years? At least, Grace agreed, automatically starting to rise. The general waved her back down. Please, stay seated. My knees aren't what they used to be either. He joined them at the table, accepting coffee from a server who appeared almost instantly. When Diana called to say you were here, I couldn't believe it, he said. The legendary Grace Wilson back at Westfield. Grace shook her head. Hardly legendary. Let me be the judge of that, the general replied. You may not know this, but I was one of the first pilots to use your bypass procedure in a real emergency. Engine fire caused a hydraulic leak in my F-15 back in 1999. I remember the incident report, Grace said, surprised. I didn't know you were the pilot. I was, he confirmed. And I've never forgotten what you told me afterward when I came to thank you. You said, I don't fix planes, I keep pilots alive. That stuck with me through my entire career. Grace did remember saying that. It had been her personal philosophy, during her years in service, that her ultimate responsibility wasn't to the aircraft, but to the, people who flew them, Colonel. Harding tells me you're on your way to Walter Reed, the general continued. Annie's offered you transport on our C-21. Grace nodded. It's very generous, but I don't want to be a bother. It's not generosity, it's respect, the general said firmly. And it would be my honor to personally ensure you get to Walter Reed on time. Consider it a small repayment for saving my life all those years ago. Looking around the table at the four officers, all watching her expectantly, Grace realized resistance was futile. These people, these younger generations of Air Force personnel, genuinely valued what she had contributed. Denying them the chance to show their appreciation would be denying something important to them. All right, she conceded. Thank you, the general beamed. Excellent. Now, while we have you here, I hope you don't mind if I invite a few more people to meet you. There are some young maintenance officers who would benefit enormously from hearing about your experiences. As Grace nodded her agreement, she couldn't help but think about how differently this day had turned out than she'd expected. This morning, she had been just another passenger in seat 12F, an older woman whom other travelers barely noticed. Now somehow she was being treated like visiting royalty. It wasn't the recognition that warmed her heart, though. It was knowing that her work, quiet, methodical, behind-the-scenes work that she had poured her heart and soul into, had actually made a difference. Had saved lives, had mattered. The few people the general mentioned turned into a steady stream of visitors to the officers' mess. Young maintenance officers, veteran pilots, and even a group of fresh-faced cadets from the training program all stopped by to meet Grace. Each had a story, either their own experience with the Wilson bypass or one they'd heard from a colleague. Grace found herself sharing technical details she hadn't thought about in years. The younger maintenance officers asked particularly insightful questions about how she'd identified the hydraulic system weakness in the first place. It wasn't anything dramatic, she explained to them. Just attention to detail. I noticed a slight vibration pattern during certain maneuvers that didn't appear in the manufacturer's specs. When I traced it through the system, I found the potential failure point. But developing the bypass, that was the real innovation, said one young lieutenant with obvious admiration. Grace shook her head. That was just problem solving. The real challenge was convincing my superiors to implement it. As you might imagine, suggesting modifications to a multi-million-dollar aircraft isn't always welcome. How did you manage it? Another officer asked. Grace smiled slightly. I had a sympathetic commanding officer who let me demonstrate on a grounded aircraft. Once they saw it work, the resistance disappeared. The conversation continued, and Grace gradually relaxed into her unexpected role as mentor and living history. These young officers hadn't known her during her service, yet they spoke of her work with a familiarity that was both strange and touching. After about 40 minutes, Colonel Harding checked his watch and stood. I hate to break this up, but our C-21 will be departing soon. We should get Ms. Wilson to the flight line. The gathered officers rose respectfully. Many approached to shake her hand before she left. A young female captain, one of only 3 women in the group, lingered until last. Ma'am, she said quietly, I just wanted to say thank you, not just for your technical contributions, but for being one of the first women to reach Master Sergeant in aircraft maintenance. You opened doors for the rest of us. Grace felt unexpectedly moved. Throughout her career, she had simply focused on doing her job exceptionally well, rarely thinking about her status as one of the few women in her field. To hear that her presence alone had made a difference to younger generations was humbling. Just keep doing good work, Grace told her. That's all that matters in the end. As they left the officers' mess, Grace retrieved her carry-on from Captain Lee, who had been guarding it faithfully. The small group made their way through the base to a waiting vehicle that would take them to the flight line. I should let the airline know I won't be taking their bus to D.C., Grace realized suddenly. Already taken care of, Colonel Harding assured her, and your bag will be sent directly to Walter Reed from Reagan National. The vehicle drove them past several hangars and administrative buildings. Through the windows, Grace could see that the rain had finally stopped, though heavy clouds still hung low over the base. I should apologize, she said after a moment, for not staying in touch with the base after I transferred. I had no idea my work had become so widely implemented. No apology necessary, General Williams replied from the front passenger seat. The military isn't always great at letting people know the long-term impact of their contributions. That's something we're trying to change. They pulled up beside a sleek C-21, the military version of a Learjet used for personnel transport. The aircraft sat on the tarmac, its engines already running, a crew chief standing by the open door. What Grace noticed next made her breath catch. Lined up along the walkway to the aircraft stood 12 Air Force members, pilots, mechanics, and officers, all at attention. "What's this?" she asked, confused. "Just a small token of respect," General Williams said quietly. "When word got around that you were here, they asked permission to see you off. I couldn't refuse them." Grace felt suddenly self-conscious as she exited the vehicle. She was just a retired mechanic with a bad hip, dressed in civilian travel clothes carrying a worn carry-on bag. Yet these uniformed service members stood rigidly at attention as if she were a visiting dignitary. As she walked slowly down the line, she noticed something that nearly brought tears to her eyes. Each person wore a small blue pin on their uniform. A pin she recognized immediately as the Air Force maintenance badge with a tiny red stripe across it. The unofficial symbol of the emergency procedures team she had helped establish 2 decades ago. At the end of the line stood a young crew chief, barely 30 years old. As Grace approached, he spoke quietly. "My father served with you in Desert Storm, ma'am. Technical Sergeant Ray Henderson. He always said you were the best mechanic in the Air Force." Grace remembered Ray, a diligent worker with a talent for electronics. "Your father taught me a few things about avionics. You tell him hello from me." "I will, ma'am," the young man said with a smile. "He'll be thrilled." At the aircraft steps, Grace turned to her escorts: Colonel Harding, General Williams, Lieutenant Colonel Rivera, Major Reynolds, and Captain Lee. "I don't know what to say. This is all so unexpected. Sometimes the most meaningful recognition comes when you least expect it," General Williams said. "Your work saved lives, including mine. This isn't about ceremony, it's about gratitude." Grace nodded, too moved for words. She carefully climbed the steps to the aircraft, turning once more at the top to look back at the assembled service members, still standing at attention. She straightened her shoulders and, acting on decades of military instinct, offered them a formal salute. As one, they returned it, holding the salute until she entered the aircraft. Inside, the C-21 was configured for VIP transport, with comfortable leather seats and more space than the commercial airliner she'd started her journey on. A flight attendant, actually an Air Force loadmaster, showed her to a seat and helped stow her carry-on. "We'll be at Andrews in about 50 minutes, ma'am," he informed her. "There's a car waiting to take you directly to Walter Reed after that." "Thank you," Grace said, fastening her seatbelt as the door was secured. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Grace gazed out the window at Westfield Air Force Base, a place where she had spent some of the most productive years of her life, and where apparently her legacy lived on in ways she had never imagined. The C-21 took off smoothly, banking over the base before setting course for Washington, D.C. Grace watched the landscape below, lost in thought. This morning, she had been just another anonymous traveler, an older woman whom most people overlooked. Now, somehow, she had been reminded that her life's work mattered, that the countless hours she had spent hunched over aircraft systems, solving problems and creating solutions, had rippled outward to save lives and inspire others. Her hand went to her medical bracelet, now repaired by one of the maintenance officers who had insisted on fixing the clasp. The dog tag still hung from it, its metal worn smooth by decades of handling. Such a small thing to have triggered such an unexpected chain of events. As the C-21 cruised through the clouds toward Washington, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her hip still ached, reminding her of the surgery to come, but somehow it bothered her less now. The pain seemed a small price to pay for a career that had, in its quiet way, made a difference. Tomorrow she would check into Walter Reed as planned. The surgery would proceed, her hip would heal, and she would return to her modest life in Seattle. But she would carry with her the memory of this day, the day when Seat 12F became secondary to who she really was. Not just Grace Wilson, retired Air Force Master Sergeant, but Grace Wilson, whose work had saved lives. Grace Wilson, whose legacy continued in the training of new generations. Grace Wilson, who had earned the respect of the people whose opinion mattered most, those who understood exactly what she had accomplished. The C-21 broke through the clouds into sunshine, and Grace smiled.